to realize that all your life, not all your love, all your hate, all your memory, all your pain, it was all the same thing. It was all the same dream, a dream that you had inside a locked room. A dream about being a person.
Happy heresies and welcome to the desert of the real. Welcome to Aeon by Gnostic Radio. As sublime as the forehead of Christina Ricci, as majestic as the jaws of Ron Perlman, and as enigmatic as the first season of True Detective, this is where you finally become liberated from so many Westworlds and Gattacas, and embark on the greatest quest in your lifetime. Finding out who you really are and what reality is not. And continue on this adventure with the rest of us who have inserted that red pill suppository in that rescue operation of Hagia Sophia. Like J.R.R. Tolkien wrote, we are free captives undermining shadowy bars, digging the foreknown from experience, and panning the vein of spirit out of sense.
This is his development build. Sealed off so he can control it. He keeps it offline so the custom code he's written can't be detected and deleted.
Yes, it's a bubble universe ruled by an asshole god.
I'm so glad to be back after an absence. I hope you have missed me as much as I've missed you. The pause was due to my attendance at the Gnostic America conference at Rice University in Houston. And what an event it was, and I'm sure those of you who attended or followed on social media agree. So much high weirdness to unpack and expand in the following shows and months, including having as guests many of the exemplars who attended.
300 years ago, you'd have been burned at the stake.
So much, but now I want to focus on giving you that old-time heretical content. Having said that, our astral guest was at the event, and that is none other than Jeff Kripal. He granted an amazing presentation, as did all participants, except maybe for me. But on this April, the year of our Demiurge 2018, Jeff Kripal materializes at the virtual Alexandria to discuss his latest book, The Secret Body, Erotic and Esoteric Currents in the History of Religions. Beyond a spiritual autobiography on a truly fascinating and dynamic individual, we'll be obviously focusing on erotic spirituality and Tantra.
Kalima Shakti De.
Always honored to have Jeff back at the virtual Alexandria and its real horror show when one of his books arrives to the Canoma. You might notice that Jeff continues many of the themes we've covered recently and will continue to cover in future shows, from Jason Giorgiani to Gary Lockman, soon.
It's too late. Always has been. Always will be. Too late.
One of these themes is a more refined but still valid definition of gnosis. It's more hermetic. This dimension of gnosis is when our minds, left and right, lower and higher, work at full capacity to become more embedded in both material reality and transcendental realms. Fueled by imagination, intuition, and a desire to create the beautiful and the useful. It's having that mind of Christ that Paul writes about in 1 Corinthians, or the supreme mind depicted in Sethian writings. I did say embedded in material reality, but that doesn't mean we accept or even think it's positive, but are unified to it, per the quote of Tolkien, to pan the vein of spirit. We see nature as it truly is because truth sets us free, and we sympathize with all that is conceived by man or God.
This planet is dying. The human race is killing it.
So you've come here to help us?
No.
You said you came to save us.
I said I came to save the Earth.
The Gnostics were described as dualists, but their dualism was always about the separation of ignorance and understanding, falseness and the authentic. The Gnostics were truly about wholeness. What's more, once we are connected with the world, we find deeper vistas on how to heal it, rescue divinity from it, even negotiate and draw powers from it, like any good magician or animist. That, in a sense, is another way to leverage Gnosis. Like Gary Lockman wrote, Gnosis is immediate, direct, non-discursive cognition of reality, knowledge of the hidden or invisible realms or aspects of existence, an experiential knowledge. It's gotta be experiential.
Unfortunately, no one can be told what the Matrix is. You have to see it for yourself.
Again, that doesn't mean we're home or reality is even benign. It just means we see matter honestly and intimately, including nature and society, and then can better go inward for transformative energies in the world of archetypes and forgotten gods. Jeff touches upon this, as have recent and past guests.
No one knows what it means, but it's provocative.
As a bonus, we'll be broadcasting our trimorphic Paranoia, where a threesome of heretics discusses an interview and its topics, and continue these discussions in our Inner Sanctum of Gnosis private Facebook group. Scott Smith appeared in the first two, but for a balanced perspective on erotic spirituality and Tantra, we have the privilege of being joined by Dr. Joanna Kujawa. Like Jeff Kripal, Joanna is an outstanding academic in her own right, with a keen specialization on tantric systems, ancient Gnosticism, and Eastern mystic traditions. Can't think of anyone better, besides Jeff, for this discussion. For more information on Joanna, please visit, you got it, joannakujawa.com, or check out our show notes.
Save it for Queen Doppelpopulus.
A lot going on, and that certainly includes this exciting episode, the Trimorphic Paranoia, and all the content I will unpack from the Gnostic America Conference. All of this to hopefully empower you to become divine and fulfilled and break the bonds that Jehovah and his angelic mafia placed on you before you were cast in a monkey suit.
Got it all wrong, holy man. I absolutely believe in God. And I absolutely hate the fucker.
He is with us nonetheless.
Like June Singer wrote in her seminal A Gnostic Book of Hours, Gnosis is based not in the understanding of the mind, but in the sensibility of the heart. In its ancient form, it was concerned with a radical dualism that envisioned an alien God who's transcendent to this universe, over and against many gods and goddesses who are believed to reside in and to exercise a measure of control over the world we live in. The transcendent God, also called Spirit, is revealed through fragments of light that exist in human beings and that form a bridge between the world and the dwelling place of the Most High, whose realm is beyond the cosmos or any part of it that we are capable of exploring by rational or scientific means. Only through revelation, or, to use a contemporary term, intuition, it is possible for us to gain access to Gnosis. Thus, it may be called inner wisdom.
If the world that we are forced to accept is false and nothing is true, then everything is possible.
On the way to discovering what we love, we will find everything we hate, everything that blocks our path to what we desire.
Let's continue panning also for our inner wisdom, let's continue writing our own gospel and living our own myth. It's all fun and games until someone loses a third eye. And then it's just gnosis.
I've been watching you, Jack. You're curious. What are you looking for in those books? Do they bring back old memories?
You won't get anything from it. My memory's been wiped to protect the
security of the mission. Yes. You can't have your precious memory falling into the wrong hands now, can you? You just repair drones. Don't go into the radiation zone. Don't ask too many questions. Not part of the job description.
This is the AM Byte interview, and we are joined by Jeff Kripal. Always glad to have him back on, and this time he'll be discussing his new book, Secret Body, Erotic and Esoteric Currents in the History of Religions. How you doing today, Jeff?
I'm well, Miguel. I'm really well.
Well, glad you're here, as I mentioned, and let's get started. It seems to me that the reason you decided to write The Secret Body was you basically got a message of somebody saying, will the real Jeff Kripal please stand up? Is that more or less what happened?
Well, sort of. I mean, it wasn't one person. The origin of the book really lies in the lecture circuit and giving lectures to different audiences at different universities and discovering that different people would approach me about different books that I had written, and they only knew that one book and assumed that was essentially the entirety of the project. And I realized that everyone was reading me through essentially one book, sometimes two, and that no one was going to read all the books, and so it was somehow up to me to try to figure out how they were all connected and whether they were connected, whether there was a kind of deeper subtext or secret text behind the corpus. So that's sort of the origin of the project.
And why is it entitled A Secret Body? What is that exactly, Jeff?
Well, it's like a lot of titles, it's multi-layered. It first of all refers to the corpus behind the corpus. In other words, the overarching patterns or themes or big ideas that tie all of the books together. So the secret body there is the sort of basic collection of ideas that I've been exploring all these years. But it also refers to the two parts of the book. The book is essentially in two halves. The first half is called corpus, which of course means body, and the second half is called mysticum, which means mystical or secret, so hence secret body. And the first half of the book is basically about the first half of my career, which really focused on male sexual orientation and mystical literature, hence the body. And the second half of my career really focused on the nature of consciousness or mind, hence the mysticum or mystical or secret part. So essentially that's what secret body means as a title.
Yes, it was great to read because, again, it's nice to know. It's interesting to know about your personal life. I remember having a professor telling us, we don't just go into a puff of smoke as soon as we start lecturing and then materialize the next day. We have a history. We are human beings. And right. Being a freshman going, really? No, you guys are just part of the system. So it was great to see about your life. And you grew up basically a normal Midwestern child in Nebraska. You had some magic like the Wizard of Oz, and like me, you hated the monkeys. I hated those monkeys too. I always, to this day, I think of those monkeys. But what exactly happened that things changed and you stopped being a normal child or normal teenager?
Well, I sort of explore different theories in the book. I mean, the bottom line is when I hit puberty, I became super, super pious and also profoundly anorexic. I essentially stopped eating which in my own mind I was fasting. So there are different psychosexual reasons for that. I also explore this idea in the book that a few years before that, I fell out of a tree and broke both my elbow and a couple vertebrae in my back, and I sort of play with this idea that something opened up in the spine or the base of the brain, because you find that actually in a lot of stories that the seer or the shaman has some sort of neck or brain injury. So I wondered about that, but I really focused on the psychosexual issues and becoming anorexic and having really my whole world kind of come crashing down because of that. I mean, all my dreams were culture bound at that point. I wanted to be an NFL quarterback or a comic book artist, practical things, and being anorexic sort of destroyed all that and sort of set me off on this religious path.
And what made you decide to enter the seminary to pursue the life of a monk?
Well, I wanted to be holy. I was trying to be a saint. That's why I wasn't eating. And a monastery seemed like a really good place to do that. So I essentially wanted to be a monk. So I entered a monastic seminary connected to a Benedictine monastery when I was 18.
And at the time, anybody wonder that this might be, again, an eating disorder, a disease, that you were really anorexic? Did anybody bring it up, or did you look, or you just were so blinded by the light of holiness that you knew this was it? I mean, I'm sure your family was concerned.
No, my family was horrified. They were crushed, and they were deeply upset. And I was miserable too. I mean, I was suffering. Being anorexic is not a pleasurable experience. It's a very obsessive, compulsive kind of behavior. But there wasn't even a word. Anorexia wasn't even a word in American English in the late 70s. Karen Carpenter died, I want to say in 83 maybe. I don't know, we could look it up. But it was really Karen Carpenter's death that brought anorexia into the American public imagination. And most of my suffering was well before that. And of course I was a male, and it was always associated with females. And so when I was going through it, there was no such word and there was no sensibility around it. It was just extremely weird behavior. So that made it even worse, of course. There was no model for it.
And in the seminary, what exactly happened that changed you? From what you write, obviously it was realizing that there was a lot of gay men in the seminary and they were sort of living a lie?
Well, no, I don't think they were living a lie. I mean, two things happened in the seminary. One was the monks got very concerned about my eating disorder, and they put me into psychoanalysis and essentially cured me. Freud essentially cured me of the eating disorder. And so I discovered the unconscious. I discovered that people's religious behavior could be driven by psychological or sexual forces that are completely outside the purview of the ego. So that was revelation number one. Revelation number two was that I was essentially a confused, sexually suppressed straight guy in a community that was predominantly gay men who weren't, I don't think they were living a lie. I think in the early 1980s, they were pursuing a life and a vocation that was actually very positive and could at once, nurture their own sexualities in a sublimated way and was also acceptable by society and their families. They didn't really have any options in the early 80s. And so the religious life, I think, was a very powerful and very positive option for them. But I didn't fit into that. I was sort of a misfit in that world. And so that was big revelation number two.
Yeah, as you write, Freud cured you of your eating disorder, but he also cured you of your holiness. You were suddenly very free.
That's
and
right.
You even mentioned you had your dreams changed, didn't they? Everything changed.
Yeah, my dreams. When I went into psychoanalysis with a monk, by the way, who was the analyst, and I immediately began having these wild kind of almost stereotypical Freudian dreams that were quite humorous, but were also very healing. They helped me understand why I had stopped eating and why I was anorexic. And as soon as I understood that, the obsessive compulsive behavior just disappeared. And I hadn't eaten in 6-7 years, and so I was really, really hungry, and ate pretty much everything in sight for about 6 months. So it was a very, very powerful experience to be controlled by something for that long and then suddenly to be free of it. It's hard to communicate what that meant to a young kid.
And what made you decide to go into the world of the scholar? Why did you decide to pivot that way?
Well, so it comes right out of that. So I had discovered the unconscious, and I had discovered the importance of sexual orientation in my own religious tradition, and I had discovered that the inside of my religious tradition was nothing like the outside of it. The outside of Catholicism in the early 80s was very homophobic and very condemning of homosexuality. The inside of the church was very homoerotic and very playful and very healthy, frankly, in many ways. And so I just was so stunned by that disjunction, both between the ego and the unconscious and the outer face and the inner face of my own religious tradition, that I wanted to pursue the study of religion and try to figure that out. And in particular, I also wanted to see if I could find any mystical traditions that were both male and heterosexual, because there weren't any in Catholicism. And so I went looking for those, primarily in India, but also elsewhere.
And this led you to the University of Chicago, and again, very interesting to find more about you and your fascinating light. This led to the experience you call the night. Could you tell the audience about this amazing experience you had? Again, another pivotal time in your life?
Well, so yeah, the reason I went to Chicago is because a lot of the other graduate schools didn't accept me. It wasn't some kind of magical choice. It was just I went to the institution that let me in, let me through the doors. But when I was there, I decided I wanted to study Indian Tantra because it looked like it might fit what I was looking for, and I ended up in Calcutta studying really the goddess Kali and something called Shakti Tantra and Ramakrishna, this great 19th century Hindu saint. And while I was there, Kali Puja was going on in the fall, late October. And Kali Puja is this amazing multi-day festival in which thousands of pandals pop up all over Calcutta. A pandal is a temporary structure. It's essentially a temple, kind of a bamboo temple structure in which is placed a very elaborate clay and painted image of the goddess Kali standing on her husband Shiva. And they're quite beautiful. Sometimes they're very eerie. Sometimes they're very scary. Sometimes they're very erotic. But this was going on all over the city. And I had come back from actually visiting those pandals and fell asleep. And sometime in the morning or late in the middle of the night, I don't really know what hour it was, I felt this incredible energy come into the room or come out of me. I actually don't know where it came from, but it was on top of me, as it were, much like the goddess Kali stands on Shiva, who is lying on his back, just like I was. But it wasn't subtle. It wasn't like a simple dream. I actually thought that there was some kind of electrical problem in the wall, and I was being electrocuted. That's how powerful it was.
Wow.
And then I thought I was having a heart attack and I was dying. But it was also incredibly erotic. I was sexually aroused, and I was, having all of these visions of these erotic scenes, and so it was really overwhelming. And at some point, the energies they were sort of conscious. They knew what they were doing, or that's how it felt, and they just sort of imploded into my heart region. And when they did that, I left my body and I floated up to the ceiling of the room, and I had this sort of classic out-of-body experience, which was really scary. And I tried to get back into my body. I eventually, of course, did. And when I got back into my body, another thing about the experience was I couldn't move. I was paralyzed. So it was kind of a classical sleep paralysis event as well. But after the OBE, the out-of-body experience, and I came back into the body, I got control of my muscles and limbs again and sat up and was just kind of stunned by the whole thing. And the feeling of it was, this is a metaphor that would only come, a decade later, but it felt very much like an incredible amount of information had been downloaded into me through this energy. But I couldn't have told you what that information was. I couldn't have articulated it the next morning. It just felt like my whole body and soul were abuzz, literally, and that, it somehow knew things. And so I decided that the way to figure out what it knew would be to essentially write it out. And so that's what I've done my whole life, is sort of try to write this energy out. And that's really what became these 6 and now 7 monographs.
So as you write, it's similar to Philip K. Dick's 2374 experience, but you do say, thank God it wasn't that intense. But Valis was downloading upon you.
Yeah, I'm not Philip K. Dick, and I don't want to be. I'd already be dead if I was Philip K. Dick. So he didn't live long. I mean, it kind of took him out.
And then the other, you, of course, became an academic, and you wrote Kali's Children. And again, I had no idea, but this was a hugely controversial work. Maybe tell the audience briefly about this, and it's still resonating to this day.
Yeah, Kali's Child was the name, was the
Yes.
title of the dissertation, and it then was the title of my first book, which came out in '95, and it's all about this Hindu saint Ramakrishna, and it looks at issues of sexual orientation again and ecstatic mystical experience. And basically what I did in the book is I looked at the Bengali texts that were then translated or not translated into English, and showed that even those that were translated into English, that they had bowdlerized and censored a lot of the original Bengali. And what they often censored was the erotic stuff, which was inevitably homoerotic. It was very much kind of in the Platonic tradition. Ramakrishna would go into ecstasy looking at a young male, for example. And so, I showed that pretty definitively in the book, which came out in '95. And by '97, there were the first ban movement was up and running against it in India. It was a national ban movement in all the newspapers. And then again, there was a second ban movement in 2001 when I was teaching at Harvard. And at that point, it was even debated in Parliament. So, as a result of those ban movements and the early kind of internet hate campaigns directed against me, I pretty much became radioactive in particular academic contexts, and certainly in a lot of Hindu communities, none of which had read the book, but had believed all of this nonsense that was written about me and the book on the internet. And so, that's essentially what happened. It turned out, looking back on it, I was the first American scholar of Hinduism to be targeted by the Hindu religious right. But after me, they, targeted dozens of other people. And today it's just common knowledge in the study of Hinduism that, this is something that is part of this recent history. And that being targeted is unfortunately quite common now.
Yeah, it happens in all places and times. Again, they need a scapegoat and so forth. They need a something to project to take away from other issues. Yes, and for the audience, it's Kali's Child. I got it wrong. I apologize. Didn't this open some doors to you? I mean, a lot of prominent people were supportive about it and still are.
Yeah, no, it's like a lot of things that are important. It shuts doors and it opens doors. It shut the door on my early career. I could no longer go to India, and I could no longer emotionally write about Hinduism without all sorts of anxiety symptoms going on. But about the same time it was being targeted, it was also being read by a man named Michael Murphy, who founded the Esalen Institute in Big Sur, California. And Mike just loved the book for its vision of Ramakrishna as a kind of tantric mystic, and invited me out to Esalen after reading the book one night. And so I went out to Esalen in '98, and have been going out ever since for 20 years now. And Esalen's been very much a part of my life, really since that first visit out there. And it's really because of Kali's child. So, I have to be I very much mourn the negative results of the book, but I have to be very grateful about the positive ones.
There's this passage in Secret Body, Jeff, where you tell Michael Murphy that you relate to Nightcrawler. I thought that was great, and I guess I assume because most people know Nightcrawler had a pious background as well, but why of all the X-Men Nightcrawler?
Well, no, so you might have got that a little wrong. So when Mike first called me after reading Kali's Child, he was in San Rafael, California, and I was in Pennsylvania, so there was a 3-hour time difference, which he forgot about. And so he called me like at 9 o'clock his night, and it was midnight at our house, and he was really embarrassed, and so he calls himself Nightcaller. And so we joke that his X-Men is Nightcrawler.
Okay.
So it's a pun. It's a silly pun and a joke. But here's the interesting thing about it. So, to get geeky on you, Nightcrawler is actually the son of Mystique.
Right,
who
yes.
I am sure is based on Kali.
Oh, yeah, very much.
She's a blue woman with skulls, wears skulls for jewelry, and of course that's exactly what Kali does. And Mystique essentially is just French for mystical. So there is this weird kind of connection there between Kali's Child and Nightcrawler, and Mike is Nightcaller. But it's just an inside friendly joke. I don't want to make too much of that.
And speaking of comic books, again, another interesting tidbit. As you said, your book, which we discuss, a book I definitely keep on my shelf, really enjoyed, and that's Mutant and Mystics. And you said it was actually used in a comic and a big comic hero movie to help them with character development.
Well, again, it was read on set and it was gifted to the cast afterwards. I don't think it played any significant role in the plot or anything, but I was just honored to have it on, to basically sign 12 copies and gift it to the cast after the movie was made. One of the screenwriters was a big fan of it. That's how that all came about.
You talk about finding positive erotic religions or that support male heterosexual eroticism. What are some of them that you found in our modern times? Are they? Yeah, that's all I know. All men will sign up for that.
Yeah, none. I
none.
mean,
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
This is the irony. I mean, so male heterosexuality gets captured by society and sort of the secular life, for reproduction and family and job and profession and all that. But it's not really allowed to escape into the mystical life or into the religious life. And you have these male heterosexual mystical writers throughout Western history, of course, people like Jakob Böhme or William Blake's a great example, but also Teilhard de Chardin. I mean, so you can find these characters, but every single one of them is essentially marginalized or even considered heretical. So, my argument is not that you can't find male heterosexual mystics. My argument is that whenever you find a male heterosexual mystic, you can bet your bottom dollar that he will not enter the Orthodox canon. Because essentially, to have an erotic heterosexual mysticism, you need a female deity of some sort, or at least a bigendered or transgendered one, and you just don't find that. At least in the West. And even when you find it in Asia with the tantric traditions themselves, depending on the country, are often quite marginal and heterodox as well. So,
would you say this is just for religion's overall dislike for sex in general? I mean, what is the reason? Or is that simple as that? Religion, we got to separate the body from the spirit.
No. I wouldn't say that. I think it's way more complicated than that. I think religion historically has been the province of people with sexualities that are not heterosexual. And this is where they've gone for refuge and for creative expression and for community. And so this is why a kind of sublimated, often celibate homoeroticism is precisely what is orthodox, and any kind of active heterosexuality is precisely what's heterodox. So, for example, take Gnosticism, take ancient Gnosticism. I mean, one of the things that I think marginalized a lot of early Gnostic communities was their heterosexual sacramentality and the way they really tried to create a heterosexual Christianity, and that came up against orthodoxy, with Jesus being completely celibate or unmarried, i.e., not with a woman.
Yes, you talk about this in your book, Secret Body, and of course we talk about this in The Serpent's Gift, and we talked about it in our interview many moons ago. The different aspects of Jesus, the Gnostic Jesus, he's kissing women on the mouth, he's surrounded by hot women, he's dancing with other guys and laughing and having a good time. But the Orthodox Jesus, he's bordering on homoerotic, like in the Gospel of John, taking off his clothes and washing the quote-unquote feet of our disciples and that stuff. So you go and say, yes, the Orthodox Jesus is very homoerotic.
Yeah, I mean, all of the Gospel of John, I mean, Jesus has a beloved disciple who's another man. And, Jesus is asks for his male disciples to castrate themselves in the Gospel of Matthew. These are not heterosexual impulses. So the Orthodox Jesus becomes entirely sexless, essentially, but sexless in the sense of not attracted to women, not having anything to do with women. And the Gnostic Jesus becomes, as you say, kind of deeply sexual. And of course, that's the Jesus that gets suppressed or unremembered. So I don't, as in The Serpent's Gift, I don't presume to know what the sexuality or sexualities of the historical Jesus was, but we do know that the memories of the historical Jesus were very diverse, and that those that were heterosexual got suppressed as marginal or heterodox.
You mentioned William Blake, and that might surprise some, Jeff, because William Blake is England's poet. So why do you think Blake is emitting these sort of erotic or verboten energies to the audiences, to the world?
Well, have you read him?
Yes, I have, but yes.
It's pretty obvious.
One of my favorite poets.
Yeah, it's hard to read Blake and not see the eroticism and the kind of really wild kind of pan-eroticism of the poetry and of the illustrations. But, again, he fits my model because he's wildly erotic, including heteroerotic, but he's also deeply, deeply marginalized and basically considered mad in his own day. And, he gets rehabilitated later, but it's way later. And, only after he's gone. So again, it's kind of fits my model of a heterosexual mystic who never really enters the mainstream canon. I mean, academics love him, intellectuals love Blake, but he's hardly an Orthodox Christian mystic.
Right, and then as you write, the 60s really discovered him.
Oh, they loved him. They absolutely loved William Blake. That's when he starts showing up on every other cover or rock poster.
And of course, we've got Aldous Huxley, The Doors of Perception, and so forth.
Right.
And that's interesting, and it would make sense because from what I read, his wife couldn't have children, and she was a part of, you might say, a denomination that you had to have sex for procreation. Blake tried to get a mistress. His wife said no, no, no. So basically in a celibate marriage. So he would be the perfect example. Those energies had to come out in his art.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's so much good scholarship on Blake. I mean, I don't presume to know all that scholarship, but I know these themes have been explored extensively.
Yes, indeed. And something else I wanted to bring up, and that is, of course, you have done a lot of work on Ufo Ology, extraterrestrial encounters, all that, including your last book, Supernatural, that you co-wrote with Whitley Strieber. And something many people might think, well, what does Ufo Ology and eroticism have anything to do with each other? But as you write, this is very connected, right?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of abduction accounts are erotic to the core, and they're often wildly sexual. Many of them happen literally in bed. So whatever this modern abduction phenomena is, it's clearly interacting with human sexuality and really in the lines of traditional mysticism and demonology that we see from the ancient through the medieval periods. I mean, a lot of these abduction accounts are really essentially there's nothing in them that you wouldn't find in a 14th century succubus or incubus account or an encounter with an angel or a demon or something. They're just now framed in kind of Cold War sci-fi terms as extraterrestrial.
And one of the great extraterrestrial encounters is, of course, and you write about it, is Our Lady of the Fatima. And of course, we both know, and you quote the work of Jacques Vallée. And then you talk about visiting this art in Florence called Our Lady of the Saucer, I believe. Why do you feel, or why do you think the Virgin Mary is such a conduit for these extraterrestrial experiences?
That's a great question. Yeah, to let your listeners know, I was in Florence years ago, and I was looking for a particular painting, which is this famous painting of the Virgin, and there's like a perfect UFO or flying saucer in the background with this shepherd and his dog looking up at it. I mean, it's really obvious. And so I went to the museum where I was told that was, and I met two different museum workers, one of whom was male and sort of arrogantly told me that it had nothing to do with the UFO. It was just the Holy Spirit, which I found completely unconvincing. And then the other woman just lit up when I asked her about it, and she said, "Oh, La Madonna dell'UFO, the Madonna of the UFO," and she wanted to tell me all about it and showed me where it was, and she just loved it. And so I wrote this little piece in the book on those two encounters and the painting itself. Why the Virgin Mary?
Yes.
That's a good one. Well, for one thing, a lot of modern Marian apparitions look a lot like UFO encounters, but before there was anything like a UFO, you got to remember the expression UFO wasn't coined into the early 50s. But this notion of things coming out of the sky and shining light on us and being humanoid, and they're usually short humanoids, this goes back millennia. And so a number of the most famous modern Marian apparition sites, particularly Fatima, involved a short humanoid that appeared in a ball of light, essentially. And they sort of mimic, again, what will later become UFO encounters. Or, if you want, the UFO encounters are mimicking the earlier Marian apparitions. They're somehow related. They're calling on the same basic phenomenology or the same basic human response, but they're working in entirely different mythical frameworks. So it's not that I think the Virgin was an alien or that the aliens are the Virgin. It's that I think they share some deep religious phenomenology that I think we don't understand.
Yes, there's still a lot of understanding to do, and that's why you do the work you're doing. I mean, and
that would make a good T-shirt, Miguel. There's still a lot of understanding to do.
yes.
Not only is it, it's kind of funny.
Yes, it is funny. And what about, and there's something, your book is such a treasure trove of, I would say, gnosis, because you bring so much, so many thinkers and all that. And sometimes I get stuck myself because I'm reading about, Jacob Boehm and the Petri dish, or I'm reading about the visions of Blake or Paul's and his experience and all that. And I get so abstract, I forgot that, no, this stuff is happening. This is a very busy universe. I mean, there was one section you talk about Mark Twain, the great atheist. He's sort of an atheist exemplar. He's been sort of adopted. But he himself had premonition and really understood telepathy. So it really makes you understand that do you ever go, wow, it's a really busy universe out there? I mean, I'm writing about it, but I'm not exactly experiencing it.
Yeah, one of my mantras is, it's way weirder than you think.
I love that. That's another T-shirt.
Yeah. It's true, though.
Mm-hmm.
Mark Twain's a perfect example. People think they know Mark Twain, but they don't. And he was fascinated by psychical phenomena, and actually wrote 2 essays about his own experiences. He called it mental telegraphy. The word telepathy had just been invented, or hadn't been invented yet, and he had his own expression for it.
And of course, he had a premonition of his brother's death, which came pretty much true.
Yeah, down to tiny little details.
And that seems also sort of taken away because, again, you have somebody like Freud, again, another great atheist scion. But Freud himself was an advocate of telepathy, wasn't he?
He kind of waffled on it. It's fair to say he was fascinated by it. He called it thought transference. And he thought it was a common experience in analysis, but was usually mediated through the various symbolic processes of dream. And he wrote 6 essays on it. So he took it very seriously, and was fascinated by occult phenomena in general, by the way. So he's a complicated person.
Yeah, and that's odd. You would think if he was into that. Why so much tensions with Jung?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a matter of timing. His break with Jung is around 1910 or 11, somewhere in there.
Right.
I think his writings on the occult and telepathy are later than that. I think he probably, I'd have to look, but I think he probably shifted over the years. And I think the break with Jung was, a deeply personal and deeply painful thing for him.
Yeah, it certainly was for Jung, as he wrote extensively. So we got 7 Sermons of the Dead and all that stuff during that period. So Jung had his own The Night experience, 2374 experience. Oh,
Jung's dissertation was on seances. And, one of the last books he wrote was on flying saucers. So, I think Jung was absorbed in this stuff his whole life. Whether he was writing about it or not.
And throughout your book, Jeff, you take to task atheism. In one section, you write that Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion is one massive straw man. In another one, you write that at least Sam Harris is honest enough to admit that parapsychology needs to be looked at, needs to be studied. And in another one, you say that skeptics are not skeptics, but professional debunkers. What do you mean by that?
Well, so I'm actually not so critical of atheism. It's materialism that I'm critical of in the book, because I think it functions like a dogma that people don't question. And what I mean by the distinction between a skeptic and a debunker for me is, so I deeply admire true skeptics, but a true skeptic is skeptical of everything, including his or her own metaphysical assumptions, whereas a professional debunker has simply assumed the absolute truth of materialism or physicalism, and then proceeds to shove everything into that little box, whether it fits or not. So I don't have much respect for debunkers, but I have a great deal of respect for skeptics, as long as they're, real skeptics.
Exactly. I mean, even somebody like Philip K. Dick always left open that he could just be stark raving mad, that everything was a delusion, or it could be a true experience. But you also write in one section, Jeff, you say that, quote, paranormal will never be understood with the mechanistic thinking and causal models of the science as they stand now, or any other kind of rational reductionism.
Right, because they're not, the paranormal events are fundamentally conscious and intentional, and there's no room for consciousness or intention in a mechanistic or reductionistic model.
And of course, this has to be very subtle. In another part of your book, I really like, you wrote, I don't know if you're quoting, but you said, it's not that people are seeing monsters, whether that's true or not, but their experience of monsters is true.
Yeah. Yeah, people really experience monsters of various sorts.
And what you're doing is you're studying these experiences, the shifts in consciousness.
Right. Right. I'm looking at monsters as an element of human religious experience. And I'm not just assuming that there are no monsters. There may be or there may not be, but there are clearly experiences of monsters that can't be explained away with the kind of simplistic, tools that are used to do that.
This definitely relates to this, but this is another good point you bring about people like you and I and other occultists. We're studying research on psychics and telepathy, ghost apparitions, and all that. But then there's sort of an attitude with modern occultists, and let me know if you agree, that they will look at Jesus and they'll immediately get all Jefferson's Bible and say, well, these things are just tales of old people. This idea of Jesus appearing to people and all that. Oh, that's just silliness.
Well, no, of course it's not. I mean,
right,
I think those miracle stories and those resurrection apparitions are probably ancient reports of what we would call today, apparitions of the dead and paranormal events. I mean, I think the Gospels are filled with paranormal activity. We just don't think of it in those terms. We somehow block off the ancient world from the modern world and assume that there's no relationship. But of course there's a relationship. People encounter dead loved ones all the time, in physical form, by the way. People are miraculously healed from this or that disease all the time. Beams of light come out of the sky and zap people like it did with Paul on his way to Tarsus. I mean, these things are not unique to any one historical period. And once you make that move, then you can verify or authorize the ancient accounts, but you also remove their uniqueness. It's a kind of double-edged sword. The Gospels, for example, come alive all of a sudden, but they're no longer absolutely unique. They're part of a much larger human witness.
And speaking of the Gospels and Christianity, it seems to I'll go back to the story of Eden, the very powerful story of Eden and Adam and Eve. And you even talk about how ingrained it is in our consciousness. You talk about a porn store down there in Houston called Adam and Eve, which I saw when I was in Houston too. So it made me laugh that we've seen the same store. But why
it's a chain? It's a chain, Miguel. You can see it in all kinds of cities. Yeah.
I don't see it in Chicago, but yeah.
Or so you're claiming, huh?
Yeah. Don't tell anybody.
Story, and you're going to stick with it.
Yes, that's my story. But the tree of knowledge seems to be the ultimate symbol for sex, isn't it? Is it that powerful?
Well, I think, as you know, I think the ancient story of Adam and Eve and the fruit of the tree of good and evil was essentially a metaphor for sexual awakening, for intercourse. I'm not sure what you're asking there, Miguel, but that's certainly my reading of that story, and I think it plays out both in ancient Christianity and even in some more modern movements like, Mother Ann and the Shakers.
Yeah, that's what I was asking, because some people assume the tree of knowledge was a sort of gnosis to something bigger, but as many have said, it's it's the knowledge is a carnal knowledge. Like you said, it's a sexual awakening into humanity.
Well, okay, so I think, yeah, so that tree of knowledge gets used in some of the Gnostic texts a little differently. And remember, I don't separate sexuality and mystical experience. I think they're often related. So that the tree might be somehow a metaphor for sexual awakening doesn't mean it doesn't also have mystical or salvific or Gnostic components. And certainly the second tree in the Garden of Life, was all about deification, right? It was about, becoming a god. So certainly that tree and that fruit are Gnostic to the core. Whether or not the first tree were or not, I think you can read that story in any number of ways. And of course, I'm not arguing that there's one correct reading of it. I'm just offering a common erotic reading of it.
And it's a good one. And you use, again, many terms as you're trying to, again, find new paradigms that gets us away from this, again, materialistic, reductionistic view of the world that many of us, sometimes I even suffer from. And one term, or there's two terms maybe you could talk about. One is the Gnostic reversal, and the other one is a word called gnomons with a G.
Right. So the book orbits around 20 what I call gnomons, Gnomons. I don't actually remember where I first encountered that word, but it's kind of this funny made-up word around gnosis and a kind of a short saying. And so I have 20 of these in the book, which captured, the basic outlines of my thinking. The Gnostic reversal is one of those gnomons. And by the Gnostic reversal, I mean a basic method in the study of religion whereby one reduces all religious phenomena, so all gods, all goddesses, all notions of the afterlife, all experiences of transcendence, all of that gets reduced back to the human as an expression of our human nature or human being. But it turns out that this human being or human nature is not what we thought it is or was. It is transcendent. It is immortal. It is godlike. And so that's what I mean by this Gnostic reversal, where you reduce something down to the human, but then the human ends up as an expression of the transcendent. So it kind of moves in a circle. It's kind of a snake that bites its own tail at the end of the day.
Yes, the Ouroboros.
Obviously. Yeah.
Obviously, a symbol we both know. And another question, what do you mean by the quote-unquote imaginal?
Well, okay. So that's a term that most people think goes back to Henri Corbin, the great French scholar of Iranian mysticism. But in fact, it goes back further to a Cambridge classicist named Frederick Myers. And ultimately, it comes from entomology. And that's how Myers intended it. So when you're looking at the lives of insects, the larval stage is called the larval stage. And the adult stage, so like the butterfly or the moth or something, is called the imaginal stage. It's the mature form of the insect. And so what Myers was essentially how he used it was he felt that a lot of psychical abilities are essentially the imaginal forms of ordinary abilities. So you and I right now can imagine all kinds of things with just our ordinary fantasy or imagination. But when were we to have some kind of precognitive dream tonight about what was going to happen the next day, we're still using our imaginations, but those imaginations are now functioning in their fully formed or imaginal faculties. They're acting like an adult butterfly or moth and not just like a fat worm chomping on the leaves. And so by the imaginal, it's essentially what I mean. I mean, it's this use of the imagination when it takes on new powers and it begins to function in an empirical or a spiritual fashion to access other worlds or information in the future or at a distance.
So in other words, we're going back to being the X-Men, as you and I both want to be.
Yeah, I mean, this is the X-Men before the X-Men. I mean, this is Frederick Myers he's doing this in the 1880s, for God's sake. So, I mean, he's way before anybody started thinking of teenagers in tights.
Atomic radiation giving us powers and all that good stuff.
Yeah, that would come later too.
Well, wonderful, wonderful. And more or less to end, Jeff, and you cover this in your book, obviously you've taken an unusual path, a road less traveled, becoming a scholar of Western Esoterica and so forth, but your roots are still in the Midwest, and you still go back to the Midwest. As you write, this is still a difficult thing, especially in Trump America, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole chapter in the book of me just sort of struggling with the dissonance between my university community or the academic community in general and sort of middle America or the Midwest, and just really puzzled over what to do about that, how to bridge that abyss and how to communicate to a larger public audience why intellectuals think what they think and why it's important, and why something like the humanities, for example, is really crucial to a civil liberal society. And we have moved into a kind of anti-intellectual moment that's even more anti-intellectual than American culture normally is, and I think we have to struggle with that. And I don't have any clear, happy answers to that. I just have a lot of questions and a lot of struggles.
Well, I agree with you. Definitely the humanities are essential, but I think you do offer a solution, and that is what I always tell people: just pick up a history book, start reading history, because as you write very astutely, our ancestors, Jeff, were Catholics. They came to this country and they were treated poorly, like these horrible immigrants that are going to take our jobs and be ruled by this Pope in Rome and all that. But our ancestors became good working Americans, part of the American fabric. So by understanding this attitude, it can help us understand what's going on today.
Right. I mean, that's the example I use. I mean, my colleague Peter Gottschalk has written a wonderful book on this called American Heretic, and he looks at Catholics in the 19th century and then moves into the modern period and looks at Muslim immigrants. So, and what's so remarkable is that the same exact tropes that are used today against Muslim immigrants, that they're weirdly religious, or they worship some foreign god, or they're going to steal our jobs, or they're terrorists, or they're whatever. All of those arguments, or at least most of them, were all used against Catholic immigrants in the 19th century, to the point where they were burning down Catholic churches and, talking about popery and Romanism and all of these slurs against our Catholic ancestors. So that the problem, though, Miguel, is people don't read.
Amen. You're right.
And we're not getting that history on social media. Social media is a very siloing genre. You just get your own little worldview confirmed over and over again. And what we really need is a much more robust public education around actual American history and the history of attempted really bigotry and hatred towards immigrants of all kinds. And once you understand and see that, then our present moment becomes more understandable, but also easier to address. Because, of course, this will pass as well, as it always has with these previous immigrant communities.
Or as you quote, again, going back to Mark Twain, history doesn't repeat, but it certainly rhymes.
That's good old Twain. That's a
yes,
joke.
You can always, yes, there's always a Mark Twain quote relevant to the surreal world we live in.
Yeah.
But yes, audience, get a book, read books, spend less time on social media, and certainly get Jeff Kripal's book, Secret Body, Erotic and Esoteric Currents in the History of Religions. And I think that's all the time we have today, Jeff. I'd like to thank you very much for once again honoring Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio.
Thanks for having me, Miguel. I really appreciate it.
This is the Trimorphic Paranoia, and as many of you know, this is a special bonus section for members. Now, members are getting a tease where we add extra bonus content to some of the more engaging and sometimes complex interviews of Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio, and it's gone very well. And for this session, we are definitely delighted to be joined by Joanna Kujawa. How are you doing today, Joanna?
Very good, thank you. How are you, Miguel?
I'm doing great. It's great to have you back on. For the listener, we did an interview a few years ago on Mary Magdalene, and of course this will be a topic we'll be discussing. Joanna has a great blog and writes some excellent scholarly and also inspirational articles on the Divine Feminine, Mary Magdalene, Sophia, Eastern mysticism, and so forth. So definitely check it out, and we will, of course, have this discussion in our Inner Sanctum of Gnosis Facebook group, where we will be there to answer your questions. And joining us too, glad to have the Moondog Vance. How are you doing today, Vance?
I'm very good, Miguel, and I'm especially happy to be here with Joanna, since we have the Divine Feminine interest in common, and this is going to be an interesting discussion, I think.
Lovely to have you here, Vance.
Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. So all of us have heard Jeff Kripal's interview on his book, The Secret Body. So Joanna, tell us, what did you think of the interview? And I guess I really want to start with, it might be a simplistic answer. In one part of the interview, I asked Jeff, why is there anything as a heterosexual, male, erotic religious movement in the West? And Jeff was, he was stumped. He said there isn't one. I couldn't think of one either. And why this had happened, my thought at the beginning, and I mentioned this in the introduction, is simple that once upon a time you had Yahweh, who was basically the father figure of the Western religious traditions, of the Abrahamic traditions, and he had a wife, a consort, Asherah. And once Asherah was removed, that sort of left Yahweh by himself. Then it became very male-centric. So, of course, you had a lot of, you might say, blowback from that. You had the Divine Feminine marginalized. You had women marginalized. You had a religion that had no choice but to be homoerotic when it comes down to it. Do you agree with this, or what is your take on the issue of West?
In some ways, I really agree with you, Miguel, and you're spot on, because the Divine Feminine was present, but was systematically removed. And there are many feminist scholars that look to it, and other scholars as well. And I think we all feel that there is something, amiss, something is not right. And it's really not, I always say in my blog as well, that it's not about replacing a masculine with a feminine in the divine domain, right, but rather that we really need this balance between masculine and feminine, because otherwise we live in a really disjointed, unbalanced world and weird universe, as you said in your interview, right? So I think this is really beneficial for all of us. So yes, the Divine Feminine was systematically removed. And I would also struggle with finding, perfect examples, especially in institutionalized religions and Orthodox religions that actually promote heterosexual divine relationships. And the only ones that, I write about is probably just in a Gnostic version of the relationship between Mary Magdalene and Jesus, and also because of actually your interest in Simon the magician, I started to look into his relationships, and obviously Stephen Heller talks about Simon and Helena, which was also the same type of relationship. But this is a little bit like archaeological uncovering, because it's lots of other guessing work. We don't have many works left, and as I said, because they were systematically removed. and they were banned also, and called heretical. That is very difficult to actually get a full sense of that.
Well said, well said. And what about you, Vance? What's your take on this issue?
Well, I think Joanna had a lot of good things to say there, but I think you and Jeff probably forgot one of the most prominent male heterosexual religions, which was started by Hugh Hefner.
What? The Playboy Mansion? Yes.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. We had one when I was growing up in northern New Jersey. There was one at the Great Gorge near the ski area. And actually, listen to this. My junior and senior proms were just the senior prom was at the Playboy Club.
Oh, wow.
So I've been to the temple, I've been to the temple, and they have these nuns walking around, and I think they call them nuns because that's about how much clothes they had on. So little bunny tails and everything. But anyway, in all seriousness, the way I've always looked at it is that it was quite clear that the church, for whatever reason, suppressed the feminine side of God, like you guys have been saying. And, they cast Mary Magdalene as a kind of a prostitute just about, and they did everything they could to disgrace that. And it even ignores like things, the Song of Solomon and all these things in the Old Testament, which at some points were pretty emphasized as far as the feminine and sexual aspects of life. And even in the translations of the Solomonic Old Testament books, they turned the Sophic wisdom, sexy female character into the dry, sexless, conceptual wisdom in terms of the words. They took the personalness out of the words of wisdom from, a Sophia to dry wisdom. So it really is true, though, that aside from my kidding, they've taken that feminine aspect of religion away in Western society. It's just usually not there.
I agree with you. Absolutely agree with you, Vance, that what was done to Mary Magdalene, it's basically nothing short of outrageous. And I'm really interested in Sophia as well for this reason, because I do believe that Mary Magdalene was a kind of a Sophia presence in Jesus's life, and I'm kind of trying to reconstruct it. But also the only way that I could perceive Sophia in very sensual terms, it is by seeing her in a different light, so to speak, not this Neoplatonic disembodied light, but being exposed a lot to Hindu tantric traditions. I kind of find similarities between her and the Shakti in Hinduism. So wisdom doesn't have to be just a rational wisdom, and I think that this is what we tend to think about wisdom in the West as this rational kind of mind, when in fact wisdom is also intuition, which is much more sensual, which is much more attuned to so-called élan vital. And I really love the French scholars because they are very much into feminine spirituality as well. I have a quote here from a French scholar, Jacques Lacarrière, who says about the divine splendor that is the form of a woman in the form of divine feminine. I think you have to be French to notice it. So Sophia doesn't have to be this dry wisdom. Sophia can be a sensual wisdom. It can be intuition. It can be inspiration. It can be intellection. It can be the sudden grasp of higher knowledge. And I think once. But I must say that this insight comes to me from tantric traditions of Hinduism, and I wouldn't be able to acquire it in the West.
Well said, and I do like, Le Carriere's book, The Gnostics. It's a great book from a philosophical standpoint. Also deals with Simon Magan, Valentinus, and all that, so highly recommended, and that's for sure. I think you're 100% right that Sophia, and this is something that was brought up by Jano Kuliano in his book, The Tree of Gnosis, she is very sensual. She is, when she is cast out or she's in her lower form, she is experiencing the universe. All her senses are challenged and stimulated. Of course, it's her own passion, and she has to come to the other side in her own fall and passion and restoration, but she does experiences these things. So as wisdom, as you said, wisdom can be organic, it can be earthly, it can be sensual.
Absolutely. And that's why very often, even in mythology, she's being seen as prostitute. And I think it's just a misunderstanding of her sensuality and perhaps some kind of fear of female sensuality and sexuality as well. It has to be somehow dark and therefore the prostitute.
I would agree. And I never had a problem, for example, in, I forget what Nag Hammadi text they call Sophia as a whore and all that, but Sophia is also us. She is the soul's adventure down in matter, and all of us really are whores in some way or another. Basically, in the ancient times, a whore or a prostitute just meant a lost soul that's down in the world of matter, making money the wrong way, which is basically most of us, isn't it? I mean, we're all down here.
I know. I must say this is very true. This is, if it is a symbol of a lost soul, that's a wonderful, actually, metaphor. Yeah.
You know, Miguel, another thing is, this is a big one. I was brought up in the Catholic Church, as were you, and the Holy Ghost, oh gosh, the Holy Ghost. I was scared of Holy Ghost when I was a kid. It's a ghost, right? Oh man, that's going to haunt me. Right?
Something out of Scooby-Doo.
Yeah, then they came up with Vatican II, and that became the Holy Spirit, All right, that's a little better. But really, then, not too long ago, I realized that the Holy Spirit is feminine, That's the other side, the Logos and then the feminine side. And the church totally censored that and then neutered the Holy Spirit. And you heard what Joanna just said about the intuition, all the things that flow through us. The very communication channel to the divine is the Holy Spirit, according to the Bible, right? The comforter, the paraclete. And who would have ever guessed it was feminine growing up and taking catechism?
Absolutely. And, I often talk about it, that Sophia was translated in the Latin Bible into Spiritus Sanctus, which is basically, as you said, perfect phrasing here, neutered from the feminine to some kind of, God knows what it is, some kind of castrated being, basically.
Monster.
That's right. And I think it's Margaret Barker that is talking about it as well, how even when John the Baptist is baptizing Jesus and other people, when this is the mother comes in the form of a spirit and like as grace. I like to think about Sophia also as grace, and she actually gives him this wisdom. She gives him this enlightenment. However, all of this, of course, was removed from the scriptures, the way we know it now.
Exactly. Again, that homoerotic power had to come through, that male domination. I mean, the Gospel of the Hebrews does call the Holy Spirit a female. We don't have it now, but we just have a few of the quotations. So I wanted to ask you too, we covered this before in our last interview, but it's been a few years, Joanna. And tell us, how did you, the audience really would probably want to know this, how did you become interested in Mary Magdalene and Sophia? I'm assuming, like Vance and I, you were brought up Catholic.
Yeah, I was brought up a Catholic, and in fact, I spent many years trying to be a good Catholic. I had few attempts, and it didn't work. And in fact, I was like a favorite student at the Pontifical Institute, and I think I was kind of craving maybe attention, and I was really very much interested in it. And I must say that my experience with Catholic teachers and Catholic professors was very good, meaning they're really bright men, all of them men. And we had fantastic philosophical discussions. So my argument wasn't with them. My argument eventually became with the dogma, which when I realized that there is no way that I can have any spiritual nourishment from that. So it wasn't a feminist stand, and it wasn't really about Mary Magdalene at the beginning. It was just, I realized there is nothing there for me to nourish. I'll obey or disobey, and it's really dry. And like many Westerners, I turned into the East, and it was a very beautiful journey for me. And then after having Shakti path, and so it's kind of formal awakening, and I had some tantric experiences. I was asked to go to Jerusalem with two men, and who believed they discovered some archaeological sites related to the life of Jesus. And I started to, and they basically started to passing some texts to me, including the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, and I was amazed, that I spent years studying Christian philosophy, and I've never heard about.
Wow.
The Gnostics.
Wow.
You know, I've never heard, I knew there were some heretics, you know, but, you know, nobody ever actually named them even. You know, and I was a top student at the Pontifical Institute, and I've never heard of them.
Wow.
And I read the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, and it blew my mind. And when I read the Gospel of Thomas, you know, and it went from there. And when I was in Jerusalem, I started to have experiences, but I again believe that I had the spiritual experiences simply because of what I have learned really from Hinduism. And I realized that there is something into the teachings of Jesus, but that the teachings that Jesus actually taught were completely lost and excluded from the Bible as it exists today. And then, you know, in some places they can be still found, like the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, which are, of course, all Gnostic works.
What would you say in your new adventure of discovering the Gnostics and Mary Magdalene? Who would you say Mary Magdalene was? Who is the true Mary Magdalene?
Wow, I mean, this is an ongoing mystery. But personally, obviously, I'm just talking about my personal view. Personally, I would say my favorite vision of Mary Magdalene is the one as who is the legitimate disciple of Jesus, and also most likely he's.
Do you have any memories before the mission? Before this journey went?
Our job is not to remember. Remember?
Do you remember her?
And there you have it. A sensuous and sublime interview with Jeff Kripal on his latest book, The Secret Body, Erotic and Esoteric Currents in the History of Religions. Yes, it really is weirder than you could ever imagine. And it really is a very busy universe beyond our mundane senses. But that's why heresy is so much fun. And you also got a teaser from our trimorphic Paranoia with Dr. Joanna Kujawa. For members, we will continue analyzing Jeff's interview, covering so many topics and going deeper into erotic spirituality and Tantra. In fact, the bonus content is very adult-oriented and even graphic, as it is Aetherium profound at the same time. So you have been warned. XXX for that 888 Christos consciousness. Only $5.99 a month to join, complete and no partial shows. Access to more than 385 episodes with the best and brightest in Gnosticism, Western Esoterica, and free thought. Your own private RSS feed where you can listen to all complete shows on the podcatcher of your choice. And for patrons, we now have an exclusive one for you. You'll get an invitation to our Inner Sanctum of Gnosis Facebook group, where we will continue this discussion on esoteric spirituality and Tantra with Joanna and Vance. Many past guests hang out there, like Robert Price, Tim Freak, Andrew Phillips Smith, Steve D., Robert Sullivan, and more. And I'm always there to directly and personally answer your questions and issues, and give you news on the shows before they happen. Same benefits if you become a patron at Patreon, except you get early shows. If anything, to help out, a few shekels here and there via PayPal or the US mail goes a long way. I'm so grateful you're here with me, keeping this Red Pill cafeteria open. I'm so hopeful you're discovering new dimensions of yourself you never thought you had. You make me feel like a natural aeon. And like heaven above you, the spy that loved you, I'm keeping all of your secrets safe with me tonight. Goodbye, and hello, as always.